Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Bearer session. We're really delighted to be here. My name is Sue Fletcher-Watson. I am a professor of developmental psychology based at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to be presenting and also moderating in this session on understanding and deploying a neurodiversity framework in education. So just to give you a little rundown of what to expect in this morning's Hot Topic Symposium. First of all, that this is a sort of co-produced or co-presented symposium from the two Salvesen Mindrum centres. So the Salvesen Mindrum Research Centre is based at the University of Edinburgh. The Salvesen Mindrum Centre is a third sector community organisation. And in the research centre, which I direct, we focus on research evidence relating to neurodiversity, additional support needs in school and across the lifespan. The Salvesen Mindrum Centre is a sort of direct help and support organisation that also has a sort of campaigning role in the community as well. So I'm going to kick off the symposium by talking about a sort of general introduction to neurodiversity and its application in an inclusive education framework. And that will be focused on sort of orienting to the topic and setting out a sort of future vision of what neurodiversity informed education might look like. We'll then hear from Dr. Dinah Aitken from the Salvesen Mindrum Centre, and she'll be talking about a piece of research looking at the experiences of neurodivergent young people and their families during COVID and the lessons that we can learn from that. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Alyssa Alcorn, who will be talking more specifically about a way that we might think about applying a neurodiversity framework in the classroom, namely the LEANS project, which stands for Learning About Neurodiversity in School. So those three talks are going to be back to back, about 20 minutes each, and then we should have a good 20-25 minutes at the end for some discussion. So all three speakers will be up on the screen at that point, and I would invite you please to go ahead and post questions throughout the talks, and we will try and address as many of them as we can as a panel when we get to that last section of the symposium. Okay, so I will take it away then. So the outline of my talk this morning is going to be starting with a sort of definition of neurodiversity, then directly addressing some common ways in which neurodiversity and its application can be misunderstood when we're thinking about neurodiversity in an education context. And then I'll go through three ways in which we might, or three features of a neurodiversity-informed school, and think about specifically how a neurodiversity framework might help us address some of the problems that I think we already have in inclusive school settings, and some kind of steps towards change, recognizing, of course, that making positive changes and achieving the goals of inclusive education requires also systemic change, investment in schools and resources. So, I want to be really clear throughout all of our talks that we're not minimizing the impact of the kind of broader context, but we will think a little bit about what people can do within their individual classroom or school. I'll finish with some take-home messages and then I will hand over to Dinah. Okay. So defining neurodiversity. So at the simplest level, neurodiversity is a scientific fact that all human beings vary in the way that our brains work. So we take in information in different ways, we process it in different ways, and as a result of those differences, we behave in different ways, we respond differently as well. So key kind of elements of neurodiversity, key kind of basic facts include the fact that neurodiversity is naturally occurring, right? So Mother Nature, if you like, has created this variety between human beings in the way that our brains work. And similarly, neurodiversity then is a property of the entire human race. So we all could designate ourselves some kind of neurotype. Lots of people, possibly the majority, might describe themselves as neurotypical. Another way to think about neurotypical is not so much in terms of the way that our brains work, but being in a group of people who seem to be thriving within the current system as it stands. And when I say the system, you know, the broad kind of culture and context, not just schools. But at the same time, as well as having some sort of categorical neurological identity, which could be neurotypical, but it could also be autistic or having ADHD or dyslexic, we are also individually different from each other, of course. Okay, so we often use a metaphor of trees in a kind of woodland as a way of thinking about the concept of neurodiversity in a little bit more detail. So if we look across these 5 trees, one of the first things we can see is naturally occurring variation, right? So these trees with no particular intention are all different kinds of trees and are growing in different kinds of ways. And those differences are of equal value. Right? There's no one tree that is better or preferred to others. In fact, the strength of these trees comes from their diversity, right? What we would be trying to create or what would naturally be occurring in a woodland or created in a garden would be a rich and varied biome. We would be looking for different species, different kinds of plants to be growing there. The other thing that we can see in this example, so there's 3 apple trees up here on the slide, and we can see that even though those are all apple trees and therefore belong to the same category of tree, they are individually different from each other in the way that they're growing, perhaps in the types of apples and the taste of those apples and so on. But we can also see bigger categorical differences. So the difference from one apple tree to the next is a small individual difference. The difference between an apple tree and a palm tree, or an apple tree and a willow tree, is a larger categorical difference. And we can see that in this group of images, the palm tree and the willow tree have a kind of minority status or divergent status, we could say. The final way in which I think this metaphor works really well for thinking about a diverse classroom and all of the different kinds of children in the classroom is that the differences between these trees relate to differences in needs. So the palm tree might need lots of hot weather and sunshine. The willow tree needs lots and lots of water to thrive. So these trees, their differences relate to differences in their needs as well. So all of this is a kind of metaphor for the diversity that we see in the human population, and of course, more specifically in the average mainstream classroom. But as I said, neurodiversity is more than a kind of description of the way things are. In fact, the person who coined the term, Judy Singer, has specifically said that neurodiversity is political more than it is scientific. So just to explore some of the ways that neurodiversity carries political implications. The first is the scientific fact that neurodiversity is naturally occurring suggests that no one is the right way to be. There's no correct neurotype, though there may be a more common neurotype, which, as I said earlier, tends to kind of thrive in the system as it is. And so as a corollary of that, having accepted that neurodiversity is naturally occurring, we obviously want to seek to accept the differences between people rather than eradicate or minimize these in any way. Neurodiversity, another way in which we can think of it politically, is that neurodiversity aligns with other equality and diversity dimensions. So because the experiences of people in neurominorities or neurodivergent people are heavily determined by social dynamics, things like prejudice, stigma, ableism, stereotyping. All of these things influence the experience of a young person, a young autistic person, a young person with Tourette syndrome, a young person with developmental coordination disorder growing up. And as a result, then, that means that we can't fully understand the experience of someone who is from a different neurotype than us. And that means, in turn, that we really need to work together in neurodiverse teams or collectives if we want to understand and apply the concept of neurodiversity. Finally, neurodiversity makes a positive contribution to our society, right? So the emphasis here is on diversity itself as having value, rather than the talents or strengths that individual people hold. Just like with the trees that I showed you, a rich woodland will involve lots of different species of trees growing there, and a monoculture will be a less flourishing environment. And so I think that aspect of the metaphor really helps us understand how we should value neurodiversity itself for the diversity itself. So this was a phrase that my co-presenter Dinah came up with when we were talking about this session, that adopting a neurodiversity framework means a transition away from pathology to humanity. And I wanted to pop it on the slide because I thought it was an excellent, succinct summary of what we're trying to achieve with this framework. Okay, so just delving into a few common misunderstandings. I've got 3 of these slides. The first that I see quite often is neurodiversity being used as a synonym for SEND or ASN or ASL, whatever is the acronym for additional support needs that you're using in your part of the world. So there's a risk here, if we just do a sort of find and replace job in our documentation, is that we change the language but not the underlying actions. Another problem with using neurodiversity as a synonym for SEND is that diverse doesn't mean rare. Neurodiversity includes all of us. And so if someone talks about meeting the needs of neurodiverse students, they mean the entire student body, right? So that's one of the lovely things about neurodiversity, is the fact that it's so inclusive of everyone. And so it shouldn't be used as a synonym or as a tool for dividing and sorting children into different groups. Instead of that kind of find and replace approach to neurodiversity, we need instead to think how and why things are done in our schools if we want to adopt a neurodiversity framework. So this is a quote from Judy Singer, who coined the term, as I mentioned earlier. And they say, neurodiversity is not a classificatory term dividing us from them. We are all neurodiverse. We live on a neurodiverse planet in which amoral nature generates endless genetic diversity, while we humans have evolved the capacity to make judgments about nature's bounty. What neurodiversity brings us is a challenge to find a place for everyone and to distribute the bounty fairly. So they're really emphasizing there the idea that it's human beings who have imposed their kind of value judgments onto natural classifications or variability. And we need to be thinking critically about those value judgments, quite often rejecting them and making sure instead that, as she says, we're finding a place for everyone. Another common misunderstanding is that neurodiversity is a simple focus on the strengths and talents of individuals. Now, of course, helping people find their strengths and talents and providing opportunities for them to flourish is an excellent thing to do. But if we use neurodiversity solely in that way, it carries with it a number of risks. The risk of putting additional pressure on neurodivergent students to find something to excel in, perhaps the feeling that they should make up for the difficulties in other areas by having some sort of special talent or skill. The risk of also dividing people into more or less valuable groups according to whether they have those kinds of particular talents. And of course, this focus on the individual forgets about the value of neurodiversity and the strength in describing a property of a group. Instead, of course, as I've said a couple of times, neurodiversity reminds us to focus on diversity itself as a source of strength. So here's a quote from a neurodivergent scholar writing recently about an article. And she says, discussing autism, ADHD and dyslexia, this article claims the term neurodiversity was created to shift the focus from the negative connotation of these conditions towards the positive. A statement that waters the entire concept down into a floppy, milquetoast version of its former self. It's not a nice euphemism for autism, and it's about far more than just fighting negative connotations. Okay, so the final misunderstanding that I come across quite often that I wanted to address is the idea that the neurodiversity paradigm rejects the concept of disability and denies people's support needs. So this comes along from the fact that, obviously when talking about neurodiversity, talking about naturally occurring variation, about strength in diversity, about the right of every person on the planet to be here and to have opportunities to thrive, we can seem to drift away from the focus on the very real needs that some people might have in relation to being able to flourish in our society or in our classroom more specifically. So this is a nice quote from Robert Chapman, who's another leading neurodiversity scholar, and he says, "We should not jump to rejecting the very possibility of mental pathology or of a wrong brain. Rather, we must work on allowing more space for individuals and groups to self-define as healthy or ill, as different or disordered, perfect or broken, in need of either medical or political intervention or whatever combination of these." So he's really emphasizing the breadth and the openness and the inclusivity of the concept of neurodiversity, which accommodates people who are seeking help, people who are seeking understanding, people who are seeking greater respect, and everything in between. Okay, so just in the last kind of 5 minutes of my talk before I hand over to Dinah, I wanted to just lay out 3 ways in which I think a kind of neurodiversity-informed classroom might look, and specifically relate them to challenges that I think the inclusive education agenda is experiencing at this time, and indicate some sort of steps in the right direction that we might be thinking about taking in our research, in our classroom practice, in our policy, and so on. So the neurodiverse school should be fostering a diverse community of learners. This is really hard. We know that people struggle with the range of different needs in their classroom. Teachers are often asking for more training to understand specific profiles, particularly, diagnostic categories, things like autism and ADHD. There's a lack of adequate resourcing to provide the individualized support that we might like to provide to many young people in the classroom. And all of this is one of the kind of factors that feeds into increased rates of school exclusion for children and young people who are neurodivergent. So how can we push forward with this? And I just want to flag again the point I made at the beginning about the need for systemic change, investment in our schools, resources for teachers, and so on. But at an individual school or classroom level, I think we can think more immediately about drawing on the expertise of our neurodivergent colleagues, neurodivergent educators in the staff room, and of course, our neurodiverse body of learners themselves. Part of this is going to involve an openness and a capacity to have a dialogue about conflicting needs, because if we have a diverse community of learners in the classroom, sometimes what someone needs will directly conflict with what someone else needs. So, for example, movement breaks and moving around the classroom might be really difficult for someone who needs kind of silence and stillness in order to focus. I also think it's important to flag the idea that sometimes it's possible to make adjustments for a particular person in the class and actually just make them available to everyone. Obviously, this doesn't work with everything. You can't offer everyone in your class a laptop. But if you've taken the trouble of creating a checklist for the morning routine, or a visual timetable, or just a printed copy of the instructions for a task, why not have copies of that available for everyone in the classroom? And I'll come on to a little bit why I think that's important as well on the next slide. So one of the things that we're obviously trying to achieve across multiple services, including in schools, is child-centered practice. This is really difficult because support at the moment is very often gatekept by a diagnosis. This can be disempowering for teachers because it shifts the emphasis onto a clinical type of expertise as opposed to an educator's expertise. And another reason why this is a real problem is that diagnosis is not equally available to everyone. There are well-established ethnic, gender-based, social class-based disparities in access to diagnosis. So everyone needful of support in the classroom will not necessarily have a diagnosis. And that links to the point I made on the previous slide about making adjustments available to everyone. So we can remember that not everyone who needs support has a diagnosis or some kind of learning plan. And another way to tackle this, as well as offering supports freely, is to encourage self-advocacy skills in young people and believe people when they say that something is impossibly hard for them and when they ask for help. Creating an environment where it's okay to ask for help and to receive it without judgment is also, I think, a really important part of applying the concept of neurodiversity in schools. Finally, I wanted to flag the issue of mental health. This is obviously a very current topic in our schools, but was so pre-COVID as well. We know that neurodivergent children and young people experience higher rates of mental ill health, as well as being more vulnerable to bullying and victimization. There's widespread stigma around neurodivergence, and this can lead to people trying to mask their identities, experiencing shame and perhaps fear of being caught out. So how can we create an anti-stigma environment in our schools? I think some of the points made on previous slides around offering support freely, creating an environment where it's okay to ask for help are an important part of this. We can also think about representation, things like seeking out reading material for your class that features neurodivergent characters and ideally was written by neurodivergent authors. We need to crack down on the bully and not the bullied. And I'm sure this seems like a completely obvious statement, but it's actually extraordinary the way that the response for many autistic children who experience being bullied is to provide some kind of intervention for the autistic child, for them to learn to become to blend in better, to become more likable in some way. And of course, if we analyze that, that seems completely at odds with their human rights and their well-being. I also think creating peer support opportunities, environments for neurodivergent young people to come together, to learn from each other, to feel part of a community is a really important aspect of enabling neurodivergent young people to flourish and to have more positive mental health outcomes. Okay, so just drawing to a close then, my takeaway messages for you. The first one is to remember that neurodiversity includes everyone. So a classroom, a staff room, your research group, your community, the parent body at a school, all of these groups are by definition neurodiverse. If we want to think about specifically people who are thriving in the system, we could describe them as neurotypical. People who might need extra support to meet their needs that aren't already being met by the kind of status quo, we could describe them as neurodivergent. And that umbrella category includes various diagnostic groups, such as autistic people and so on. Of course, individuals will choose to identify in different ways, but this is useful terminology for talking about things in general terms. Applying this concept then in schools and in education research more generally requires a shift in perspective, not just in language. Neurodiversity is a socio-political statement, not just a scientific fact. And then broadly speaking, in terms of how we apply this, I would say that the single best approach is to make sure that we're working with neurodivergent learners and with neurodivergent educators as well, and to co-create new ways of delivering education. So I'm going to hand over to Dinah now. She's going to talk about experiences during and lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to hear the family perspective through those data that she collected. So that's over to you now, Dinah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sue, and thank you to BERA for the opportunity to share the work of Salvesen Mindroom Centre with this audience. My name is Dinah Aiken, and I'm an honorary fellow at the University of Edinburgh. In my day job, I'm head of outreach at Salvesen Mindroom Centre, and we're a Scottish charity working to support children and young people and their families, as well as the professionals who work with them. When we were set up more than 20 years ago, our client group was children with learning difficulties, but things have evolved and our understanding of neurodiversity has evolved and the charity has evolved. And so working under the banner of It Takes All Kinds of Minds and the vision of No Mind Left Behind, we're adopting the philosophy and language of neurodiversity. I want to start with a caveat because I'm aware that there are educators in our audience. And in the work at Salvis Mindroom Centre, we come across brilliant teachers, brilliant schools, and great local authorities. And we know that there's extensive good practice in pockets around the whole of the UK. But the charity exists because we don't have it right everywhere and all the time. And it is families who are experiencing problems who find the way to our door. So please don't interpret this presentation as in any way hostile. The aim is to understand the problems so that we can collectively work our way around to the solutions. So for my presentation, I'm going to share some slides and some learning from a recently conducted small research study. I've added in some random pictures of birds. This is only to add visual interest and break up the text, and just because I had the photos available from another project I did looking at nature around my home in East Lothian. There's no other reason for the birds, but I hope you like them. We are people who were already running on empty. That was what one of the families told me when I conducted the research. So I conducted this small study during July and August this year, and I used telephone interviewing mostly, although 2 participants took part via Teams. I asked the participants about the impact on them of school or college suddenly closing, and what it was like to learn or not learn at home, as well as the return to school. I ended each interview asking the participants to reflect on what advice they would give policymakers for the future. The limitation of the study is, of course, its size. There were 6 parents and 1 teenager interviewed. However, from years of practice in this field, I would venture to say that the range of experience narrated here is typical of families supporting neurodivergent children. So I could interview 100 families or 1,000, and although each story would be individual, the problems encountered would be replicated over and over. Most of the participants in this study were in Scotland, but 2 were in England and reflected on the experience at an academy school. So I do intend to undertake a thematic analysis of the data, but I haven't done so yet. And so today I'm simply going to report my findings to you. So the study provides us with some answers to the question, what is a neurodiverse family? The 6 families represented here had 15 children between them, of whom 10 were identified as neurodivergent. The ages of the children were from 10 years to their early 20s. Some families were headed up by single parents, others identified 2 parents in the household. All of the participants were female, coincidentally, but not unusually for this kind of inquiry. Some families only consisted of 1 child, while others had 2 or more, up to the largest family with 5 children. In some families with more than 1 child, every child in that family was neurodivergent. Most of the children had at least 1 formal diagnosis. Others were still undergoing assessment, and many had self-identified conditions or traits thereof. At least 2 of the parents in this study described themselves as neurodivergent. And some of the children were attending mainstream school or college full-time, others were part-time, and some were not in education. This slide contains all of the conditions that families ascribed to their children and young people, in no particular order. The neurodivergent conditions were foregrounded by the families due to the nature of the study, but many of the young people were also contending with other physiological issues like asthma, peanut allergy, or ME. Every child had more than one of the conditions or issues listed here, and for some children, their health and well-being was extremely complex, with more than half a dozen of the factors listed here being present for them. It is unusual for neurodivergence to present as a solitary issue, and we need to develop our understanding about the complexity of life in neurodiverse families, as this slide really illustrates. I describe this as the work of families to achieve a diagnosis and appropriate support. Because despite legislation that describes support as a right, it is in fact extremely hard for families to arrive at a point where they feel that their child is understood and supported well and receiving appropriate education. Even in this small study, many of the families had been asking, demanding, pushing for support for several years. Many had been through legal processes to seek support, and all of the families had been active in seeking a diagnosis or assessment. Although for some this was still an ongoing process, and several families had issues that remained undiagnosed even after a period of years. One child had been mistakenly diagnosed with a learning disability and had attended a special school as a result, and several of the children had been bullied, which required the families to take action to address these issues. More work. Factoring in how time-consuming this can all be, the parents, all mothers in this study, had adapted to supporting their children, and this included giving up their employment altogether, adopting flexible working, or stepping down in their career. One mother said to me, "There is no me," and that from the time of her daughter's diagnosis of autism, she herself had disappeared. In practical terms, this meant that she had given up 2 jobs that she was enjoying and had devoted herself to skilling herself up on autism, acquiring new parenting skills, and to running the household and being with her child 24/7. I asked the families specifically how they dealt with the abrupt closure of school or college. Within and across families, there was a broad range of experience, as you can see here. One family found the approach between the special and the mainstream school to be widely different too. Parents learned a lot from sitting alongside their children and observing closely how they did or didn't cope with the home learning. One said, "I realised through lockdown how difficult it was for my child to work and focus, and I couldn't sit with her." And another commented, "My child was working one-to-one at college and really liked it. Study over Zoom she didn't like because there was no interaction." And as the first quote here shows, there was an impact at an emotional level for many of the children and young people. Here, emotional decline was linked to this particular child's need for social interactions with her peers. The decline also resulted in the child self-harming. Another young person repeatedly attended at their local hospital looking for some kind of help. Others became extremely reclusive, and while some managed the idea of COVID as an infection quite well, others found that a very frightening concept, and this affected the whole family's ability to get out or have any social interaction at all. There were, however, some families for whom learning at home provided relief because it took away the anxiety about attending school and being in a large class. One parent said, "I could be mum again, not the person taking her to that horrible place." When I asked about the learning experience during the first lockdown, there was widespread dissatisfaction. With the exception of one special school, there was no sense of the different needs of children being addressed. And there was a real sense of a deluge of work being sent home and overuse of digital options, so that it just felt really overwhelming. And even in this small sample, the digital divide was evident, with one child struggling to manage without a laptop or an iPad. She only had a phone to do her learning on, and this was despite requests by her parent to the school for support. From all the families involved, it was apparent that the parents had to shoulder the burden of the home learning, not just directing and supporting their child, but managing some fairly complex administration. Overwhelmingly, the biggest complaint was around a failure of communication, with parents citing that it was missing entirely or it was inappropriate or ticky box. There was just some evidence of good practice, and several families mentioned having encountered one professional who was supportive or helpful, and this made a great difference. Others had older children who could help to clarify the IT required or the schoolwork itself. So the second lockdown came. For some families, there was no sign of improvement in the second lockdown. However, for one or two others, there were some improvements in the communication and support from school, and one or two of the children knew what to expect, they knew what was expected of them, and they could manage better the second time around. Blended learning worked for 2 of the young people, with smaller groups online being beneficial because they were less daunting. There was evidence that this also allowed the schools to see the child in a different light and to appreciate their potential. Other parents remained adamant throughout that their child simply could not do online learning, even in the second wave. So the evidence here again suggests that there is no single approach that can meet the needs of all learners, and neurodiversity is not a catch-all but lends itself to universal solutions. When I asked the participants what the worst thing was, they reflected back on the issues highlighted thus far. One parent made the point that already there was no proper learning support and their child just couldn't do the online learning. And as already noted, one young person who'd been managing comparatively well at college just couldn't manage the Zoom classes, and her learning came to a stop. Another parent said it was exhausting, draining. The COVID situation made things more difficult for my child. She was barely dealing with a new day. The emotional toll on children and young people was the most concerning thing for many of the families. One parent said their child became anxious, depressed, and could not get out of bed, unable to do any schoolwork. And the young person interviewed described herself as being depressed and stopping caring about things. Parents keenly felt the practical impact and talked about juggling the needs of all the family. There was no let up. One parent took to playing her musical instrument to get some time alone and signal to the family that she wanted to be by herself. And another found just a few moments alone in her car was all the respite she could find. One family highlighted that they felt hampered by the lack of a written curriculum, meaning that the parents struggled to help their child effectively. Parents' mental health was adversely affected. One said, "It was the hardest time of my life with no support for the children," and she described becoming depressed and requiring antidepressants. Against that quite bleak backdrop, I did press on to ask if there were any positives. One blunt response was no, it was a disaster. But others could find some positive aspects, such as having the opportunity to see at close quarters what their child was capable of doing, and that informing how they envisage future learning. There was an appreciation of life slowing down, and for some families, being able to spend more time together was a good thing, although another parent said that was the last thing that their child needed. Not having to go to school was most beneficial in 1 or 2 cases, and the pressure on schools to deliver work in written format definitely advantaged some students, with the bonus that this was something one family had been asking for over many years and had been denied. Most families, as I mentioned, had encountered at least one teacher, pupil support assistant, or teaching assistant who was empathetic and helpful, and this did make a positive difference. The lived experience of neurodiversity is clearly extremely varied and complex for families. And while wider society is learning more about what neurodiversity means, families already have clearer insights. One parent put it as, "Kids with neurodiversity are between us. It's hidden disability." One parent commented that there is a total ignorance in methodology of neurodiversity and executive functioning and how to assess people. And another said, "The education system is not set up for neurodiversity in my experience." While a third said, "They seem about 30 years behind in terms of understanding about neurodiversity." Several families were frustrated about the lack of training and awareness among professionals in both schools and colleges. Lack of training, understanding of neurodiversity and diversity. You have to look at every part of your school and how it's impacting, was how one put it. And the quantity and quality of training was not sufficient. One parent said, "In regular school for 10 teachers, only 1 teacher has autistic training. All of them need training." And another one said, "I'm having to educate them constantly. The knowledge, a 2-day training course is nothing." And actually, several of the parents commented on their efforts to provide useful information to schools and college to supplement this absence of training and awareness, this adding to the burden of work for parents of neurodivergent children. So some words to people in power. I asked the participants from their expert knowledge to say what could have been done differently and any advice to people in power to try and influence change. And you can see here, please stop trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Why can we not see the potential of our young people? Even though parents are great, need to understand they have needs as well. I'll always do what I can, but sometimes I'm worn into the ground. And there has to be training for all the pupils so they bully less a kid with autism. One said, make all record of needs statutory for children. We've had learning support teachers saying, I can ask the teachers to do those things, but I can't compel them to do it. And another felt that colleges were doing a better job of engaging hard to reach students, although others had a different experience of that. But from that parent's perspective, she commented, look at colleges and see why do the disengaged do well there? I think it's continuous assessment. And importantly, this last point, that all children should be trained in autism so that, in the parents' words, they're not nasty to a child who is autistic. So just to round up on the potential learning from this research study, I'd like to leave you with these thoughts. That neurodiverse families are themselves extremely diverse. There is no typical version of neurodiversity. That neurodivergent individuals are coping with a range of complex issues that affect them psychologically, physically, and emotionally, often all at the same time. That supporting a neurodivergent child involves work for families. That parents, most typically mothers, make adaptations in their life so that they can have the practical and emotional space to carry out that work and secure the best support for their child. And that the pandemic and the lockdowns did not create problems for these families. Life was already challenging and sometimes scary. All the pandemic did was lay those problems bare for more of us to observe. And in many cases, it made an already difficult situation much, much worse. The idea that there is a lack of understanding and awareness of neurodiversity was widespread among the families for whom this is real life. The bigger question for us today is, how do we shift that narrative? And as I noted right at the start, for neurodiverse families, the pandemic burdened them to a point where they needed to say, we are people who were already running on empty. And the note to end on, picking up on the point made by a parent about training to all pupils in school, the young person that I interviewed made this observation. She was speaking from the perspective of someone who has ADHD and who had received very little in the way of support from her school before, during, or since the lockdowns caused by the pandemic. Indeed, her ADHD had been dismissed by a specialist in the school because if she really had it, she would be bouncing off the walls. And she observed, there should be lessons on the harmful stereotypes of all people, raising awareness in school kids young. Better teach them when they're young, not older, to stick in their brain. Wise words from a young person, and that makes the ideal point to end my presentation. It also provides an excellent bridge into the next presentation by my colleague, Alyssa Alcorn. Thank you for listening. And I'm very happy to answer questions at the end on the panel. But in the meantime, it's back over to you, Sue.
Thank you so much, Dinah. That was brilliant. Really enjoyed hearing about those data in a bit more detail. So yes, handing over to Alyssa Alcorn now, who's going to be talking about the LEANS project. And just a reminder as well to please post your questions as they occur to you in the chat, and we will come to them, as many of them as we can, in the discussion at the end. But for now, over to you, Alyssa.
Hi, good morning. I'm Dr. Alyssa Alcorn from the Salveson Mind Room Center, Salveson Mind Room Research Center. We mix up the names sometimes. I'm the lead researcher on the LEANS project, which stands for Learning About Neurodiversity at School. And in this last talk, before we go to our panel Q&A, we're going to zoom into the classroom a little bit more specifically, though we're still sticking broadly with neurodivergent children and the idea of neurodiversity. I'm going to focus a little bit more specifically on the primary age group, whereas I know Dinah was really talking about a wider range of ages. And I really do want to start by picking up on some things that Dinah mentioned that came out of the families in the study, where they often mentioned other people and other aspects of the school community, like the quote that she ended on with the young person saying, well, we need to inform other people, other kids in the school, and we need to do it young when it sticks. And I'm really going to pick up with that idea throughout this talk. And you might be excused from looking at research about neurodivergence and school-age children for thinking that that child and their teacher might be alone in the classroom, because often there's a great deal of focus on what teachers know and teachers do, or what that individual child does, or how they might be coping, or their strategies, when really we've got a whole classroom full of pupils, and there may be a lot of staff members that the child interacts with. So we've really got to be reminding ourselves that schools are communities all the time, even if our research papers may not reflect that. And as the families in Dinah's study were quite clear, what everyone knows and thinks and is choosing to do on a daily life basis is really affecting children's school experiences. And some of that very seemingly small stuff may not be so small. It only takes one comment to ruin your entire day, or to make you feel like you're valued and you belong as a part of that class community. So our big claim today, really for the whole symposium and for the LEANS project specifically, is that neurodiversity concepts and terms are a tool that we think can help get us to where we want to go in terms of providing a more inclusive and suitable and positive school environment for all children. And they're also a way in, a lever to work on what people know and what they think, and then what they do, how they act on that information in their school setting. It's a community intervention, if you will. And sort of underpinning this claim is the idea that small wins and small changes really do matter and can substantially add up to a difference in terms of what it is like to be a child, especially a neurodivergent child, in that classroom environment. Also underpinning this claim, some things Sue mentioned at the very beginning, that she really stressed about how neurodiversity is a term about groups, a term about populations. It includes everyone. So it is an idea where everyone has a stake. It is not a synonym for SEND or additional support needs or any of those related terms. It really is everyone. And then finally, I'd like to make a point about money. Many urgently needed supports or things that are shown to be very beneficial, they cost. They cost. There's no denying it. Budgets are very crunched. It's comparably cheap to work on what people know and what they believe. Those things like the stereotypes that were mentioned, that is a comparably cheap intervention that we really believe can bear fruit in terms of day-to-day school experiences. So I'd encourage you to keep that in mind as we go along. So right now, the different UK nations' curricula are already talking about other types of diversity at different ages. Cultural diversity, language, religion. Over in the sciences or geography, they might be talking about biodiversity or ecological diversity. But right now, teaching about neurodiversity is currently extremely rare or altogether absent. You'd really need an individual teacher or school leadership that was particularly keen on this concept. Because for most teachers, it's simply an unfamiliar idea right now, or there may be a lot of confusion about why this idea is different and has different uses and implications than terms they may already know about, like additional support needs. However, once we start looking at neurodiversity, we see there's actually a large number of connections to existing parts of the curricula in the different UK nations and in Ireland. So this is not a completely left field thing that doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing now, and can potentially even be very strategic in terms of showing concrete evidence of how you might be working on some of these priorities, like citizenship and human rights, health and mental health and well-being goals, inclusion goals. So there really are a lot of connections that can easily embed neurodiversity terms and concepts into what schools and teachers are already concerned about right now and needing to show in terms of the quality of their education. So I'm going to go on more specifically now to the LEANS program. And again, that stands for Learning About Neurodiversity at School. And the big purpose of this project is to develop a new free resource pack to help teachers introduce the idea of neurodiversity in mainstream primary schools. And we want it to be accessible and engaging as much as possible for both the pupils and the teachers. So this is a teacher-delivered program for the whole class, targeting that later primary school group, about 8 to 11. And the whole class bit is really, really important because so much of what's out there now does tend to focus on neurodivergent children or those with some kind of documented learning differences and isn't about upskilling everyone. And that's really the goal here, is to be working on those beliefs, stereotypes, ideas, decisions of everyone in the entire classroom, whether they might be neurotypical or neurodivergent or not quite sure what's going on with them. So it is really not about targeting individuals and trying to get them to adopt new strategies, whether that's teachers supporting neurodivergent children or asking neurodivergent children to change themselves. It's really not that kind of program. It's about informing everyone. So I've said resource pack, which is obviously very, very vague. So I'll say a little bit more about what's actually in there. And when we started the LEANS design process, we had pretty much a blank sheet. We had a timeline and we had a budget line. But other than that, we're completely open about what the resources were going to be like and what the neurodiversity content was going to be. And how we filled in the blanks was working over a period of time with a group of experienced and neurodiverse educators. When Sue mentioned needing to really kind of have a collective or have a team with different viewpoints and different lived experiences, that's the type of team that we tried to put together. And we worked with them to pin down the content, the factual content, if you will, that we were going to communicate, the format, and also the delivery and safety guidance for teachers. So the final resource pack has a big fat teacher handbook, which is really a training course in a book covering an introduction to neurodiversity and many practical tips and ethical issues, and then fairly detailed lesson plans for 7 units of content that cover issues such as communication, needs and wants, fairness, and also have a large element of self-reflection throughout. The basic format of LEANS is about integrating hands-on activities, stuff to try out, with story content about a neurodiverse class. And I'm going to come back a little bit later to why that story content is such an important ingredient. So this main format of teacher instructions, doing stuff hands-on, and hearing the stories is supported by some additional posters, videos, and then printable handout type stuff that we all expect. So what's happening with LEANS right now is that we are running an evaluation study in 4 Scottish primary schools. If any of you have tuned in today, thank you, and we love you very much. And this study is really asking about how is LEANS working in the classroom. We've done all of this development work. We've had a lot of input from teachers and community members and some child testers along the way. But what happens when it's in the full classroom with all those demands and constraints? Is it acceptable to people? Is it feasible to deliver? And then also, of course, is it successfully teaching concepts about neurodiversity or affecting children's attitudes about things like visible differences in the classroom, help-seeking behavior, friendship, any of those kinds of topics. So again, that's what's happening right now. What's coming up next is using the study findings to revise the resources a bit, working toward a release early in 2022. Again, all of the resources will be available worldwide for free forever at the point of release. If you want to make sure that you don't miss the information about the LEANS resource release, I'd encourage you to drop me an email at the project mailing address there, leans@ed.ac.uk, to sign up. I'll show this again at the end of the talk, so don't worry that you're missing it forever here. So I think it's time now to say a little bit more specifically about where we're trying to get in to affect people's attitudes and actions by talking about neurodiversity in the classroom. And a little bit more of what I mean by that is that many children of that age, that 8 to 11 age group, may not be particularly concerned with words like diversity or arguments about human rights or anything like that. A lot of their everyday experience of the implications of being in a neurodiverse classroom is things like, it's not fair. How come she gets to do that and I don't? For example, of people who might get to type up some of their written work instead of doing it by hand. Or simply the burning injustice of, but I want to do that, and you're saying I can't, and that's messing up my day. That's not fair, of course. Also, things about help seeking, that's going to be a big everyday experience, both around potentially our own differences or struggles and what we may see going on with others. Is it okay to get help? Should I help someone else? Is that the right thing to do? Assigning fault for various things that might happen, that's going to be a big one. Focusing on rightness or wrongness, or some like black and white thinking about answers, struggling to come to terms with multiple valid ways to do things, or the absence of clear answers. And then also in general, just trying to make sense of what's going on around us. Whether it's differences we see or other things going on. What are the explanations or stories we're telling ourselves and other people about what's happening and why? I mean, all this sort of stuff is really a lot of the everyday experience of being in a neurodiverse classroom and also being 8 to 11 years old. So I think if we start talking about neurodiversity in the classroom, there's several things that it particularly helps us to do. And first one goes back to that idea of storytelling of what we think we see happening and why. And neurodiversity can help give us an alternative narrative to be explaining some of those things. Why it seems like someone might be struggling at school, or have very uneven skill profiles where some things are very easy and some things seem practically impossible for that person. And really countering explanations that might be quite common, even for adults, of pointing to laziness, disinterest. They're not trying, they're being naughty, they're looking for attention. It's an alternative narrative to some of those other attributions. Another big one is about normalizing the idea of needs. And this is quite an unfortunate word now in many ways, because we often say needs in an educational context only to refer to people who may have needs that are different from those around them, or needs that are perceived as extra or exceptional in some way. But actually, everybody has needs in a school context in order to be in that setting, to understand what's going on, to participate. But for many of those neurotypical pupils, their needs are being met by how things are usually being done, so are kind of invisible. They may not think of themselves as having needs or having those needs already met. So we can normalize the idea of everyone having needs, not only a few of you over there. Talking about neurodiversity also gives us a good in to reflect on the really diverse experiences that children may be having at school, whether that's with their academic learning or their relationships with adults and peers. And this is a place where I think that using videos where real people talk about personal experience, or using fiction, can be really, really useful, because it can take the pressure off individual students in that real class. And again, I'll come back to that in just a minute. Neurodiversity, and if everyone is familiar with this general idea, also can help give teachers and adults a non-arbitrary answer to why about differences in school rules and expectations. Because this is an understandable common thing to happen. We see someone who seems to be getting special treatment or not held to the same standards or whatever, and we want to know why. And because I say so is never a satisfying answer to that question, no matter how old you are. But if they're starting with a shared understanding about everyone having needs, and they may be different, and we're trying to meet those needs so that people can be part of school, that's a true and more satisfying explanation we can point to without necessarily having to reveal any personal information about individual pupils. Closely related to that is, I think, an important part of talking about neurodiversity and that it includes everyone is pushing back against this tendency to demand justification, particularly from neurodivergent and disabled people, about what their struggles are and exactly what they need, and often asking people to almost perform their difficulties in order for them to be entitled to help or support. And there are many, many problems with those tendencies. But it's a place, again, to present an alternate message saying, you know, sometimes we need to be okay with not knowing everything about everybody else's business at school. Or maybe accept that our teacher does know, and that's going to need to be okay, even if I don't know. On the flip side of that, that you are not required to tell everybody about your own needs or struggles unless that's something you choose to do. And that's not necessarily easy, but is a place to introduce those ideas and start practicing. So for the last bit here, I want to point out also that neurodiversity is not all sunshine and roses. This is not a risk-free topic. It's a very sensitive topic, both for the teacher who may be delivering it and for other people in the classroom. And ethics and safety is something we talked about persistently with our neurodiverse design team and through the entire Lean's development process. And I'm going to highlight a few of those issues now because I really think they do apply regardless of how you may be introducing neurodiversity in your classroom. They're not specific to the Lean's materials. And the first one is that neurodiversity isn't an outgroup. This goes back to what Sue mentioned about potential confusion of neurodiversity with terms that are more prevalent now, like SEND or additional support needs, or even just the term needs or special needs to refer only to some people rather than all. So this is a place to be really, really vigilant that the way you are using this terminology and the way you're talking about it generally doesn't send people an implicit or explicit message that neurodiversity means some kind of outgroup, but to keep coming back to the fact that everyone is included, though we're not saying that everyone is the same. Another one, this is a really, really big one, is about not singling people out. And the educators in our design team were extremely concerned about this and kind of seem to see two flavors of it. One might be staff members singling out pupils saying, oh, how about you tell us about, or can you give us an example? But also pupils potentially volunteering information about themselves. You know, for some of them, they may feel very excited, they may feel seen, they may go, yes, you know, this is about me, or a place where I've really got something to say, but may not have necessarily foreseen what might happen next after that. And this really can seem like such an obvious strategy as, oh, well, this is a great place to bring in people's experiences. However, aside from the fact it can be terrifying for some pupils to be put on the spot, they may be trying to decide, do I tell the truth? Do I make something up? Do I just mumble and look at my shoes? And for the kids who maybe are happier to share about their experience or feel a kind of demand from the teacher that they have to do it, there may be unintended consequences of disclosing personal information, say about neurodivergence, about times they might have experienced certain things or certain challenges in the past. There's just an unknown. Are people going to be understanding, or am I handing a bully ammunition here by sharing this information? And this is a main reason that Lean's uses a lot of story content as a way to try to explore personal experiences and different types of neurodivergence, but without putting those demands on real students in a classroom. It gives us that specificity and a shared point of reference for discussion, but without or with minimal risk to individuals in the classroom. And this brings us to the biggest and maybe the stickiest point, is that introducing neurodiversity concepts is not going to be the right choice for every classroom or school right now. You may have one very keen teacher who wants to get it into their classroom, but that's one class as part of that wider school community where some of those priorities and attitudes may or may not be shared. And again, this is really a case where a little knowledge can in fact be dangerous and leave people worse off than before you introduced it. Do you have a school where this might be ammunition for somebody? And the Lean's Handbook, at least, really pushes people to try to reflect on the characteristics, not only of their class, but of their whole school community, to try to make a balanced judgment about potential risks to pupils and staff members of introducing neurodiversity information and going into more detail about neurodivergent experiences. So kind of combining those three issues together is we may also have ethics and safety concerns from parents. These are ones that teachers in the design process foresaw as potential concerns parents might have. A big one being, are you doing this topic because of my child? Particularly for children who already may have diagnoses or be going through that process. And closely related, well, you know, my child has a diagnosis, they have dyslexia, whatever. Will they be singled out? And these are real, viable concerns, and we've got to be ready to engage with them. And they're part of the mix when making these ethics judgments about whether neurodiversity is the right thing for this school right now. And finally, of course, I keep talking about children, but every school is very likely to have neurodivergent staff members. Maybe it's you. If you don't know of anyone at your school, that doesn't mean that they aren't there. And you need to plan like they are there. And also at all these steps of the way, consider how teaching this topic could affect staff members and potentially pose risks to them from children or families or other staff members. If you're saying to yourself, oh gosh, I really can't think of anyone at my school or in my research group or wherever, maybe think a little more about that, because there may be a reason that you don't know, and that may in itself say something about the culture of where you are. So just going to wrap up with points I'd really like you to take away now. And the first one is this big picture claim that we think neurodiversity concepts can be a tool to get in there and try to address people's knowledge and attitudes in school communities, and then the small everyday actions they're taking as a result. For example, in terms of how they're reacting to differences that they see. Are they going to conclude, oh, that's okay, that might be what that person needs? Or are they going to cause a fuss about unfairness or draw attention to it or generally make that other person miserable? Those tiny little decisions and changes really add up in terms of school experiences. Second, we'd like you to think about neurodiversity as a near future goal in your research or practice. Compared to other issues around support, it's comparably low research to try to work on what people know and potentially can benefit everyone in the entire school community while connecting very closely to existing curriculum priorities. Neurodiversity also doesn't stand alone. I had my list of kind of child statements where we're talking about, well, what's fair or unfair, or what do I want, or making sense of differences, help seeking, and help giving. So the implications of neurodiversity often really have their tentacles into all of those other concepts. And you may spend almost more time talking about that other stuff like fairness rather than just the concept of neurodiversity alone. And finally, of course, the talking about neurodiversity in school context is not risk-free. And it is absolutely critical to be reflecting on your current school community and the attitudes that are there now to try to decide, is this a topic we can introduce now, or is there maybe some other work that we need to do first? So as we go into the discussion section, I do want to underscore that we don't have all the answers. Sue and Dinah, they don't have all the answers either. We do hope that the LEANS resource pack is going to be a useful and free offering for teachers and a potential model for other researchers. But this is one way of addressing a very, very complex topic for one age group. It's not going to be right for every setting, and it can't solve every problem. So do please keep that in mind. So thank you again from me and from everyone at the LEANS project, and we'd encourage you to sign up to the mailing list to make sure that you hear about the future resource release and all of our news. So I'll pass back to Sue ahead of our discussion section.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. That was an excellent and gripping talk. Even though I'm quite familiar with the topic, I always love hearing about it again. So that was brilliant. So I can see we have some questions coming in our discussion section. So that's really fantastic. Please do post more, and I will try to keep track of everything and get through as many as we can. So I'm going to sort of guess which person is the best person to have a go at answering these questions, but we might pass some of them around a little bit. They're not all easy ones. Okay, so why don't we start with this question from Laura, who says, I had a question about the diagnostic process and the reliance on problems at school and evidence of those problems. That seems to perpetuate myths about neurodiversity, that neurodiversity equals behavioural problem plus issues with learning. How can educational communities help with that through greater understanding of neurodiversity? So, Dinah, do you want to give it a go?
Thanks, Sue. Well, it is a great question and really gets to the heart, I think, of some of the issues that the schools are facing. I suppose my fallback position around that is, if I look at the Scottish legislation, which is the one I know the best, which says that if you need extra support to learn for whatever reason, you're entitled to that support. And it's that for whatever reason bit that I think could help us out here, in that we don't actually need to put people through a diagnostic process. We just need to acknowledge that they're having a difficulty, that they need some help. And sometimes they come with the answers too. If you speak to the child, if you speak to the family, they may actually know what the heart of the problem is and be able to share that with you and give, together you can plot a path out of the difficulty that the child's facing. So I don't know if that gets quite to the question, but that would always be my starting point. Do we really need a diagnosis? I know for families, having a diagnosis, having a label can be the thing that opens a door to services, but it would be great if we could get away from that and just be saying, well, actually this person is needing some help for whatever reason.
Alyssa, did you want to add anything on that one?
Yeah, I think that some of what we can do talking about neurodiversity can be simple here by explicitly pushing back on that narrative. And as we're introducing what may be new vocabulary to pupils and some staff members, to keep saying, well, remember, we've got this word neurodivergent we learned about, but that's about differences or patterns of differences. It's not a synonym for bad or having a problem or struggling at school. And as we go through and talk about neurodiversity, to keep bringing in examples of flourishing. If we're going to use talking heads videos or fiction, that we're also hearing about neurodivergent young people being happy and doing things they enjoy and having fulfilling relationships or developing them. So to put those examples in front of people that neurodivergent isn't a synonym for problems at school. And of course, that's also going to include children who do not have official diagnoses for many, many reasons, from resources to racism. There's going to be many more children who have differences from their peers that are not hooked into the diagnostic process at all. But we've got to get those positive examples out there and talk about happiness and flourishing as well, not just problems.
Yeah, completely agree. I'm going to briefly add my own tuppence because I just think it's such a good question, if you'll forgive me, which is just to note that some of the ways in which, when there are problems, some of the ways in which they may be manifest could be quite hidden, especially in the context of an environment where there is a degree of stigma, which is, our society as a whole, regardless of the efforts being made within individual schools and classrooms. So we do need to be alert to the possibility of people struggling and working really hard to disguise those struggles. Not meaning to directly contradict what you've just said, Alyssa, But I think that's an important application of the concept of neurodiversity, is sort of opening our minds to the breadth of ways that people are operating in the school. And also, of course, using the concept to push back against the stigma that has such a toxic effect when it comes to getting support, asking for support, and so on. Okay, so Jan here is asking, they say, thank you for an interesting summary. You're very welcome. How might this apply to twice exceptional students who diverge in more than one direction? I think I'm going to go Dinah again. What do you think, Dinah?
Well, it's true, actually, that, as I said, neurodivergent young people are probably going to diverge in more than one direction. And the difficulty, if you get too stuck on the diagnosis, is trying to prioritize. So if you've got a pupil who's has a diagnosis of autism and ADHD, do you address the ADHD first, or do you address the autism first? And I think it is important to just try and take a much more holistic view of the person, and just understand what they would like addressed first. I mean, the model that we use in the charity for working with families and with children and young people is we create an involvement plan with them from the start. So we start by saying, well, what's the thing that you would like to make a difference with now? What do you think's the priority to see some change? And we agree that with them, and that's the goal that we work towards. And I think if we could move, again, it is important sometimes for people to have the diagnosis. I mean, for young people, having a diagnosis can help them understand themselves, and why they're different and why they experience the world differently. So I'm not anti-diagnosis, but I think in terms of how we give people support, it would be quite good to be a bit more holistic in our attitude and our approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the challenges, isn't it? Because in lots of ways, a neurodiversity framework in schools is a call for a much more bespoke model, and that hits then up against all the resourcing issues that we've mentioned throughout the session. So, Alyssa, David says it was touched on, but is there any research looking at neurodivergent teachers and other educators? I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
I know that there has been the Autistic School Staff Project. I'm very sorry if I'm mangling the name of that project slightly, but it's something quite similar to that. I know they're reaching the end of that project, or at least a point where they've been putting out lots of outputs, doing events, recording talks and things. So that would probably be my first port of call, the Autistic School Staff Project, or Google some variants on that. I know they've been on Twitter a lot as well. Of course, neurodivergent doesn't just mean autistic. I am not immediately aware of other research on other types of neurodivergences or multiply neurodivergent teachers. They're out there, I've met them, they have a lot to say, but in terms of any systematic research, I don't know yet.
Thanks. I will dig out the link to that and see if I can post it in the chat before we finish. Okay, there's all sorts of comments that are just saying, oh, it's really insightful. Oh, this is great. I love the emphasis on flourishing. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice things. Someone is telling us about an autistic person who has been told that they can't, but is now going off to university for his degree. So that's wonderful. Okay, this is a long question. Let me just read it. Okay, it's a comment, but I'm going to read it out. So this is from someone who's joining, I think, from New Zealand, or comes from New Zealand anyway. And they say, we have an Indigenous Maori proverb in New Zealand that underpins our programme. They've then written it in Maori, and I'm not going to attempt to read it out because I feel it would be inevitably disrespectful. But the translation is, a tree comes from one seed but has many fruits. While the fruit is the same in a tree, there are variations to every fruit on that tree. This proverb emphasizes that in our commonality, we are all different. We celebrate those differences while maintaining our relationship with each other. It's about an unconditional acceptance of differences and uniqueness. It's absolutely lovely, isn't it? And I suppose I wondered if you had any responses on the theme of, I guess, the extent to which neurodiversity is about reminding us that we're all the same, or reminding us that we're all different. You know, this is something we've talked about before, that tension of sameness and difference. Do either of you have any thoughts on that theme?
Trying to put my thoughts in order quickly here.
What about you, Dinah? You've raised the issue of sameness before, I'm sure.
Yes, well, I think the young person who I quoted at the end she was so insightful, actually. And just this idea about doing away with harmful stereotypes is perhaps a good starting point on that. That really, you don't know what someone's story is, and everyone has a story. And it's just that I think one of the things you speak about a bit, Alyssa, in the Leans project is about acceptance. And it is just about broadening out our ability to be more accepting of the unexpected responses that people have sometimes to the world around us. You know, constantly trying to improve my own capacity to do that as well. I don't think I'm answering that. That was such a sage proverb, and I feel like I haven't attained the same levels of sagacity there.
It's quite unfair to ask you to be a traditional proverb, right, on the spot. Alyssa, any thoughts?
Well, I think that proverb is a good reminder that everything we've talked about today comes from a very particular and very individualized cultural viewpoint, like an intensely individualized cultural viewpoint where we have to go, hey, time out. Remember that schools are a community. We're all part of a community. What other people does affects you, which it says a lot that we need to be giving each other and ourselves those reminders. And I thank you very much to the person who posted this, because I think it is a reminder that there's other viewpoints out there from other cultures and other parts of the world that may not have some of the same problems because they're approaching this from a completely different viewpoint, and that we need to do better listening to other ways of thinking about differences.
Yeah, you're right. That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but of course we're locked in our own cultural box, aren't we, so much of the time. Dinah, a more specific question. One of the big impacts of the pandemic and the lockdown on people's school experience was about assessments, right? The loss of the usual exam processes and so on at the end of the school year, and so we're just wondering if there's any insight specifically relating to that from your interviews.
Yes, I mean the parents were pretty concerned about, you know, for the ones who felt that their child had the potential to do quite well in terms of academic achievement. There was quite a bit of concern that the loss of the learning was going to impact on them. But there is a nice story from one of the other families that I spoke to, whose child was wanting to go from school into a college course about a film and media course, and the parent the child didn't want them to enter into the foundation level or the first level of this course, because they had already done quite a lot extracurricular work on film and media and were quite experienced. And initially the college said, no, he doesn't have the on paper qualification to get into year 2 or module 2 or, you know, the more advanced course. And this mum, who was a very good advocate for her child, persisted and said, please, would you speak to him? If you would just interview him and see what you think after that. And the college agreed, did the interview with the child, and came back and said, wow, I mean, he actually knows more than all the mainstream students who are going to be going into level 2 or level 3, whichever it was. Absolutely, he can go in at that level. And that was such a great insight into how we, again, a more holistic approach, that the sort of exam focused, paper qualification focused is not necessarily the way we're going to get to the full potential of all the young people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful that the mum managed to advocate so successfully and get that personal contact, which is such an important part, I think, of understanding some neurodivergent young people. Alyssa, maybe we should finish on this question because we're coming up to 11:30. What is next for the Leans project?
Oh, okay. Well, you probably don't want to hear about the next bit in which we enter stacks of paper data, so I'm going to skip that bit. But I mentioned that in the spring, we're working toward launching the full resource pack for free. That's going to be online. So soon we're going to start planning toward what that launch is actually going to look like in terms of, events and information and materials around that. We're also hoping very much that we can build on this resource pack out toward parents in conjunction with Dinah and the Mind Room team, because parents are obviously so incredibly important in their children's education, both to have accessible stuff that lets them know about Leans, but also gives them tools that they could potentially advocate to their school or local authority and make a case saying, this very clearly connects to our curriculum goals and could potentially benefit students in ABC ways. We're also looking more at opportunities for teacher training and connecting Leans teachers, because while there is a giant fat handbook that has, we hope, everything people will need to know, that's not the same as being able to get together virtually or in person and really workshop some of these practical delivery ideas and concerns with other educators. So we are hoping to do something around that. Some of these plans beyond the release itself are, of course, contingent on funding. If you'd like to support our work, we'd love to hear from you. But those are two immediate directions. Longer term, obviously, Leans focuses on one fairly narrow age group. And we do believe that younger pupils and also older pupils can also benefit from being introduced to and reflecting on this topic. It's kind of an open question what that might look like or if that work will happen, but we are already talking and thinking about whether that's a possibility. Have I missed any big plans, Sue?
No, I don't think so. I suppose I would just reiterate that I think that I completely agree with you, Alyssa, that Leans is not the only tool that we need in our toolkit. But at the same time, we're super proud of it. And we think it does fill a kind of unique space. And so I guess we would love everyone in our audience right now to sign up to the mailing list and to help us when the time comes to get it out there, because, we didn't make it so that it could sit in a digital, dusty digital file drawer. We made it so people could use it. So big thanks in advance to anyone who can help us with doing that. We would love your support as a community. I'm just going to finish by thanking everyone who has thanked us, who told us that our talks were insightful and resonant, and that we're doing super work. Thank you all. That's very kind and lovely.
Will we read these later, Sue? Do we get to keep these comments?
I don't know. Maybe I can extract them from the archive. I'll see if I can do a screenshot and send it to you. And then I'm just going to say there's one comment here from Joe Sell, who says, if you're interested in equity for all learners, which I'm guessing that we all are in this session, join me for the session Superheroes and Journey Takers, which talks about big equality, giving space to talk about equality for all and frameworks to help staff be critical about their bias. And that's on Wednesday at 5:30 in the BERA conference. So I thought I would plug that for you, Joe. That seems very relevant to everyone here. So now just thank you so much, Alyssa and Dinah, for joining me for this Hot Topic Symposium. everyone, I hope you feel you know a teensy bit more about neurodiversity than you did at the beginning, and have some thoughts on how it might influence education, research and practice. And please do get in touch with us if there's anything you want to follow up afterwards. But otherwise, thank you.
Thanks very much.